the cloud. So we're recording to the cloud, not only just recording, but recording to the cloud somewhere. So welcome everyone. I expect we're gonna have a few more people hopping on because as I was mentioning, we had almost 100 people register for this workshop. And we have 37 now. So, but we'll go ahead and get going because I don't think we want to keep you too long on a nice sunny evening. At least it's getting to be sunny here anyways. So welcome to Krista. This is actually the second workshop that we've done with Krista, and I had to have her back because she got such rave reviews from the workshop that she did for us back about a month and a half ago. So we had to bring her back. So I'm not going to take up any more of time chatting because we have to let Krista have as much time as possible because those that took the last workshop said that they just went away feeling so much better about things right now, and we all definitely need that right now. So I'll be trying to watch the chat, and Krista's really good at that too because Krista is a teacher as well as a social worker and a counselor, and she has many hats. So she's really good at watching the chat as well. So go ahead and ask questions if you need to. And just a heads up at the very end of the workshop, if I can just get you to hang on, because I need to ask you a question because those of us who are in the FCSS world know that we need to do outcomes. So, so without further ado, welcome to Krista.
Well, hello, everybody. Yeah, I was here, 6 weeks ago or so, like here in my bedroom. I've been here for a year and a half, so I suppose we're always here. Yeah, I did enjoy our last conversation. For those of you who were here that time, we are going to talk about some of the same material, but I'm going to hopefully make it more interesting, especially the stuff that we kind of rushed through at the end. We'll spend a little bit more time on. But for those of you who aren't, you're not going to miss anything. We're going to also enjoy some new material and talking about things in a bit of a different point of view. Because last time we were talking specifically to helpers, and now I know this is a little bit more broad-based, and so we'll see what happens. I'm gonna just share my screen. I think Lola gave me a lot of credit, but yeah, I am a teacher in that I teach social work at the University of Calgary as well as MacEwan University. But the problem with knowing so many different platforms is sometimes I forget which one is which. So be gentle with me. Okay, there we go. So the title of today is still going, right? This mental health during prolonged COVID. So the idea of that I want to focus on today is this concept about how the stress that we're all living under really affects us in terms of our physiology, right, and our body. And partly because I think, especially now that things are getting to be kind of a slog, right? We all just see the end coming, and yet we want to just keep, like, we just want to rush there. And yet we know that the numbers are worse than they've ever been, and we know that our yeah, just our concerns are really high right now. But yet hope is one of those really difficult things to manage, because we have this hope, but and then all of a sudden we get a shutdown. And so it can be really difficult on not just our mental health, but our physical health as well. And I think I want to spend some time talking a bit about that so that you can see the warning signs in yourselves, and of course the people that you work with, and as well as our families, of course, that this is something that we're all going through together, but as you're going to see, in different ways. So by the way, if you have any questions as we're going, feel free to kind of throw them in the chat room if you want. If you're brave and want to put them, turn on your mic and ask me directly, that's totally fine too. I do not care about getting interrupted. I have 2 teenagers. Happens all the time. So one of the first things I want to acknowledge, of course, is where we're at, right? And so I'm here on Treaty 6 territory, as I know many of you are, but of course there can be people from far and wide. So certainly Treaty 7 and Treaty 8 in Alberta is not unusual for us to have different people from different places, especially on a Zoom call. And so I always think it's super important that we have the conversation about where we're at, because I am definitely a visitor on this land. I came from a family of settlers and certainly feel some sense of responsibility for taking better care of the people and of the place that I am at. And I feel that call to responsibility. And so here on Treaty 6 territory, it's the traditional land of the Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit call this home. There's a rich history of language and culture that's here that happened certainly before colonization, but also, of course, is here after. One of the things that I think is really important when we talk about land acknowledgements is that they're just not words, that they're also actions. And so part of the action, of course, is for me to constantly recognize, but also to start changing my practice. And so that was what leads to some of the next slides. One of the things that I've learned in trying to educate myself around Indigenous ways of being and knowing is the recognition of situating myself, right? So when you meet an Indigenous person, one of the first things they will always do is tell you who they are and where they're from, right? And who they were born from. And so I think that's a beautiful practice that I also think is important for all of us, in that you need to know who I am so that you can recognize what is I'm full of junk about that you may not agree with, and that you can recognize where some of my blind spots might be. And so I am the daughter of Donna and Frank Wright, and they both came from Ontario. So I am one of those transplanted Canadians that came from the East. And I left there when I was 3, and I was born and raised, or well, not born, but raised in St. Albert here in Treaty 6 territory, and have had the privilege of growing up in this environment. And so that, of course, shields me to some things, and it has my eyes open about other things. I also have, of course, that's me, that little girl in that pink dress that has the same haircut as my brothers. If you noticed, I don't know what's happened in the 70s, but that's the way it is. I also recognize I look a lot like my mom, who's in that beautiful beige sweater. That actually, she knitted me this one because I loved that sweater so much that I had to get one similar to her. Um, but I am the youngest of 3, and so and the only girl, so that brings its own set of privilege. If you notice, between my self as a child, my mother, and my daughter in the other picture, is that it's really funny because we all look a lot alike, and to the point where my iPhone actually will open when my daughter looks at it. That's not supposed to happen with twins, but my daughter can unlock my phone. I'm a little disturbed by that. And so that these are the families of which I am growing, and those are really important to pay attention to when we start talking about things like this pandemic response. Where are we at, and who are we worried about? Because even out in the community as a social worker, I worry about the people I work with, but of course, primarily we tend to worry about our family too. And so I hope that you've been also experiencing some of the relief that comes with getting kids vaccinated. The last time I was here, my mom had got vaccinated that day. I was super excited. And then I have to tell you, everyone in my family has been lucky enough, with the exception of my littlest, my son, who is turning 13 in 6 weeks. So I'm going to have another teenager. But he is getting vaccinated on Friday. So we're all very excited. I hope you're having an experience of that too, because it's a very visceral experience, right? Like, it feels better. It's not just an intellectual experience, it's a physical one. And so, just a brief introduction. I kind of gone over this. I think I'm the least exciting part of this presentation, I hope. But I do have a private practice out in St. Albert. So some of the stories that you're going to hear come from my experience in the world. Keep in mind, though, of course, if I do tell you a story, I am changing enough details that these are not people you would recognize. They often tend to be collaborations of stories rather than just one individual. So if you do hear me talk, you're probably more likely to hear me talk about it on a personal level. But certainly, I work with a lot of families, and certainly a lot of adolescents that are out there in the community. And so I also do some clinical supervision for professionals as well. And then you already know, I work as an instructor at the universities, which has kind of been really interesting in the last year. I got to tell you, my tech skills have gone way up, as I'm sure all of us have. So one of the things to keep in mind whenever I do a presentation on anything is that I think these are rules to live by. So when we look at the principles of trauma-informed practice, is that we always have to be paying attention to who, where we are, and what kind of information we're giving. And so when I teach my students, I always ground our conversations in these 5 principles. And so the principle around safety, primarily everyone always has to feel safe when they're in my presence. If there's anything I can do about it to make it feel safer, it's important that I feel that way. And so what I want you to know is we're going to do some fun things hopefully today, but if you don't feel safe doing them, don't do them. Right? You can sit and be a bystander, and I'm totally okay with that. If you want to participate, then great. That's awesome. And that's the part of trust too, is that I will not pick out on you. I will not make you turn on your cameras. I will not do any of those things. But you need to build trusting relationships. And when we talk about COVID and COVID response, these are the things that really start to feel uncomfortable, right? Because our sense of safety as a society is really feeling threatened. Because for the reality is, some of us have lost family members. Some of us have been through some pretty difficult situations, and for the longest time, we didn't know what we were dealing with, right? I mean, when we think about, we shut down when there was like 2 cases, I think, in the province the first time around. And now our tolerance is very different, partly because we know more now about how to keep ourselves safe. But safety is an important concern when we talk about things like COVID. So if you're feeling overwhelmed and you need to just decide to turn off and leave, that's totally okay, because um, these kind of conversations are happening around us all the time, and they can be overwhelming. And that you need to trust yourself and hopefully trust me enough to be able to help us walk through this journey. Collaboration, of course, means that you can interrupt me whenever you want, but relationship is always important in anything we do. And that's one of the injuries that I think we've all struggled with right now, is that because we're so used to talking and being social and collaborating with people in terms of how we feel safe, this particular time in our lives has made that really difficult. We're trying to keep ourselves safe by being less interactive, but that comes at a cost. And I think that cost is starting to weigh heavy on us, because, I don't know about the rest of you, but I just want to go movie. Empowerment, of course, finding ways for us to take control, and then choice. Having the choice about what we can do and what we can't do. And so if you lay this framework over top of the experience of being a helper, being a parent, being a child, being all the things that we are, all the labels that we attribute to ourselves, if you look at your relationships with these 5 principles in mind, I think you'll find a lot of things are a little bit easier to manage. Because is this helping me feel safe? Am I building trust? Am I working together? Am I empowering people? And do they have choice? Are really important keys to do for yourself in your relationship with yourself, but also in your relationships with those around you. So I did bring this up last time for those of you who are here. And really the point of this slide is just to ground our conversation in the idea of mental health. People in Canada are feeling these effects. Now, this report came out actually early on in the pandemic, like about a year ago, and things are getting worse and more complicated. And so what you see is that a large percentage of our population is really having having problems feeling safe and secure. And so what we see is that their mental health is declining, that people are feeling more worried. Some people are having trouble coping. And of course, that we're seeing some of our family and friends struggling in the form that gets to be dangerous, like suicidal thoughts. Unfortunately, in my community, we lost one young man not so long ago, a few weeks ago, and that has had a huge impact in terms of my work as a therapist that works a lot with adolescents, having a lot of conversations with kids about feelings of being suicidal. And so we need to see these as all warning signs, and also the effects of COVID, right? That these people may not be getting directly impacted in terms of the disease itself or the illness itself, but people are getting impacted in many, many different ways. All right, I see a hand, but I don't see your name. Go ahead and just talk.
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
One is, what happens if I, per se, don't fall into any of those categories?
What do you mean?
Like, I don't feel that I fall into any of those categories. Like, I'm not feeling depressed. I'm actually doing okay.
That's awesome. And that's one of the things to keep in mind, is that everybody reacts to this kind of stress differently. And so, hey, I'm glad to hear it. That is awesome.
first off. And second off, my daughter lives in a she lives down south in Medicine Hat. And she just mentioned to me the other day that they just had another suicide. And Medicine Hat has had a high rate of suicide this last year. Why is that? Is it something in the air down there?
I have no idea, and I think there's probably lots of research that's going to be happening in terms of the effects of COVID. And is there a direct link to why there's some losses in that particular area? I don't know, right? And I can't speak to even the boy who died here, and I'm sure there's been more than one, right? It's just that I'm aware of it.
It's been this whole time. They're younger ones. They're under the age of 30.
Yeah.
And younger.
Yeah, and it goes to show, I think that when we talk about how COVID affects people, it affects people disproportionately in different ways, right? And so some people who are doing really well continue to do really well. Or for some people, like for myself, my relationships with my kids is great right now because we've spent so much time together. We're enjoying each other's space. So there is some positives that have come from it. But I also know that for my kids, they're at an age where it's super sensitive, right, in terms of what's going on. So I wonder if some of the reasons why maybe in Medicine Hat people are struggling is that younger age group is that maybe they're being impacted differently. Yeah. And yeah, I wish I could answer that question directly. I don't know the answer. And in fact, the suicide rates in the last year across Alberta have actually gone down a little bit compared to what they have been in other years. And so that is interesting. But I suspect we're going to see more, yeah, as time goes on. It's interesting because if you look at I used to do suicide prevention training for years. And so one of the things that was true back when I was doing that kind of work, probably 15 years ago, um, is that if you looked at the stats, places that were in crisis tended to have lower rates of suicide than places that were doing well. And I think it's because when we're in the middle of a crisis, we're all just worried about each other. We're all putting one foot in front of the other. Nobody's expecting life to be really great. We're just getting through. And so I think maybe that's part of the reason why we actually did okay there for a while last year. I mean, there were still losses for sure. Definitely opioid overdoses have gone up and they were already high. And so whether that's a suicide or not, I mean, is definitely debatable. It's a tragic loss regardless. But it'll be interesting to see how the research comes out about a lot of different things, including that. And certainly I hope they look into the instances in Medicine Hat to see if we can get to it so we can stop that stuff from happening. Everyone is affected, but not everyone is affected equally. And so one of the things that has become very obvious to me is that sense of my own privilege, right? Is some of us are able to work from home. Some of us are able to handle it, but who is getting sick and who is having to get time off work to get vaccinated, and those kinds of things are very disproportionate to different parts of the population. So the general population is having when we talk about suicidal thoughts, are about 6%. People already struggling with their mental health feel like it's going up even more. People with disabilities are commenting on more struggle around that. You can imagine this one strikes me just because kids in school, right? The kids in school that are doing the worst are the ones that were already struggling in the first place, right? Kids that are doing okay, your neurotypical kids that work really well in the way our education system works currently are going to be fine, right? Like they might have a blip in their learning, but they'll catch up. It's the kids that have some sort of underlying disability that may struggle more, right? Like the longer this goes on, the more you worry about some of those young kids in terms of reading, speaking, getting those interventions in place that we would normally, and that we've been putting them off for a while. And we know that, especially for the younger kids, there's a window that those interventions work much better in. People with low income, of course, are struggling more. And I can't even see that one, the last one, because you guys are all in my window. Hold on. There. And Indigenous people, of course, are struggling more as well. And so how COVID is hitting people is different depending on circumstances. And so that idea of privilege is very real and very striking. I think about this often when you talk about even just who's having access to vaccines, right? Our Indigenous folk had to call into AHS in order to get their vaccines, which took hours sometimes, or it was really difficult, where if they may have got access when at a younger age group, but they were having more complications and more barriers in terms of them getting those vaccines. And then of course, access problems. Whereas for me, I've just called up my pharmacy and got in, right? And so how we're distributing things is also trouble in terms of equity. And we're gonna have a little bit of fun. One of the things I wanted to, the big point I wanted to make today is that your mind and your body are the same. Right. And so when we talk about physical stress, we talk about emotional stress. When we talk about these different realms of our mental health, what we tend to forget is that physical health is mental health and mental health is physical health. Those two things are not different. I remember when I was growing up, whenever there was specifically a teenage girl around the sexist kind of argument, if there was a teenage girl that was sort of freaking out, they would be accused of it all being in their head, right? Oh, she's just looking for attention. It's all in her head. Well, it's kind of a ludicrous statement because, of course, when somebody is stressed out, it's all in their head. Everything is in our head. It's kind of how our bodies work. Our brains and our brains are what drive not only our emotions, but also our physiology. And so stress is physical. It's not just emotional. And so what we're going to see is you notice that there's stress probably housed in your body. Right? So stress is emotional and physical. We have physical symptoms of stress, just like we have emotional or thought symptoms of stress. They're all kind of one thing. And we often try to treat our mind and body as they're separate, but they're not. Just like our mind, body, and our soul also goes into that category too, that they're all intermingled. Trauma is housed in the body and not in the mind. The reason why I want to make this point is because I bet you can feel it at different points if you're stressed out in your body. And so what I want to do is actually challenge you today. And I'm going to show my next slide, and then I'm going to turn off my share, and then we're hopefully going to look at each other for a minute. But I want to give you a real life example of how your mind and body are connected. And so what I want you to do is just pay attention a little bit about where you're feeling stress or where you're feeling tension. And stress might not be the right word, where you're feeling tension right now. And so I just want you to scan your body, your top, all the way down. You don't have to do this with your cameras on. Nobody can see you right now. Cool. But I want you to feel it. Now, for myself, I feel it often in my shoulders. I have an old injury from a whiplash from a car accident. And so whenever I start to feel stressed, that's where I feel it first. So I feel it there. Where else can I feel it? My toes are tense right now. Those kinds of things. I get my mouth gets dry. That's why I have this huge cup of tea with me every time I talk. So pay attention to that in yourself. Okay. So do as I do, not as I say. So what I want you to do is actually, I want you to, first of all, I'm going to show you through my video, and then we're going to talk a little bit about it. So this is what I do, or what I want you to do, and see if it works for you. I can start it. Okay, so I have my screen share still on. Nobody can see your cameras. I want you to do it. I call it my Kermit the Frog arms. Show it one more time because I think it's awesome. Oh, just gonna keep doing it. All right, ready? Want to do it with me again? If you don't, turn off your camera. I want you to try it. But if you don't want to be seen, or you don't want to be on YouTube doing your arms, turn off your camera. That's totally fine. But I want you to feel it. Like, just do something. Yeah, thank you. I love Kermit the Frog. I think he's the best like role model ever. And so that's why I do that. And what do you notice about yourself? If anyone wants to I feel it in my shoulders as well as my eyes. So Taylor was saying that about stress. What do you notice about yourself after you do something like that? You can either put up your hands or turn on your mic and just talk, or write in the chat if you're not brave enough.
I feel looser. I feel loosened up a little bit.
Thanks, Lola. Anyone else?
It's
I
a
laugh.
smiling. It kind of makes you laugh. Yeah.
Yeah, makes you laugh. So it feels silly but relaxing. I see that from Calvin. Anyone else? I love it. So much more relaxed. Yeah.
It makes me belly laugh.
Makes me belly laugh. Oh, and belly laughs are the best kind of laughs, right? Get all that oxygen in your body and change. And so it's funny because sometimes we don't even know we're holding it. And then occasionally I'll just do that. And it feels like I got a massage, like in 30 seconds of just like, you don't even realize how tense you are. You don't even realize the kind of stuff you're holding until you kind of go loose. And so I challenge you all to kind of do that every once in a while. I did that with a client the other day. So that's part of the reason why I invited you to do it with me is I had a client who was just she's a young kid and she was really kind of struggling. And so we said, well, why don't you change just how you feel? Because if you change how you are holding yourself, you'll actually change how your body feels, which will change your emotions. That's how I know your mind and body are connected, because you change this and it helps you regulate in a different way, right? And so she did it, I did it. And then I immediately, when I was done that session, I sent that video to all my friends. And so I kept getting texts all day of people doing it back at me. So that's what I want you to do, is random act of ridiculousness, and do that. Tape it on your phone, send it to random strangers, and then see how we can not just hold our stress, but how you can also let it go, right? And that's what's so interesting about our mind-body connection. Therapy is becoming less and less about talking it all out, but actually also about actually physically letting it out, because your body is what holds your trauma and your stress, not your mind. Your mind just ruminates on it. And what we want to do is actually move forward there. So thanks for putting up with me on that one. You're all very brave, and we'll have to do that again at some point, or we'll have to get Lola to take a screenshot of us all doing it so that we can enjoy ourselves later. Okay, we're going back. Thanks, that made me really happy. I'm totally gonna have to keep doing it. So trauma changes our reality and our perception of reality. And so I want you to think about me using the word trauma really loosely here, right? Because a lot of people have a hard time connecting with the word trauma in terms of the experience of what we're going through right now, because it may or may not feel traumatic. It actually might feel okay. And I don't want to judge anyone for not being overwhelmed. It just means you're doing okay. That's great. That's the whole goal of life, right? And I think sometimes we judge people for good, but we also judge people for bad. Like, we just need to stop being so judgy. So trauma changes our perception of reality, the lens of which we see the world. And it also changes our perception of ourselves. So some people who have been going through this this experience are gonna feel like the person that they are has changed, because they've experienced something very different. Right now, for those of us who are a little bit more middle-aged, it might not feel as dangerous, because we might feel really confident or secure in our lives. That's great. But for our seniors, this may be the first experience of them feeling really overwhelmed or being cut off from their family. And so that can really change who they are. For our teens and our children, this is maybe the first experience that they've ever had that's been anything beyond their own issues and their own struggles. And that can really change how they see the world. It changes how we are, how we see ourselves. And these, keep in mind that these changes may be good, bad, or indifferent, but they do change how we see things. Okay. Now this is quick. I use this slide all the time, so those of you who were at my last session will have seen it, but I think it's really important in terms of grounding the conversation about who we are. And so I like to use the work of Janet Bowman, but a lot of people know this around like attachment theory with Bowlby kind of things, and that internal working model kind of conversation, if you're into that kind of stuff. But basically what it means is that we're all born into the world with with general ideas of how the world works. If we're well supported, if we're in a loving and caring family that's reasonably functional, then often we will be born to this idea that the world is meaningful, the world is benevolent, and that I am trustworthy. And so that is a really healthy, happy place to be. The problem is loss or trauma or really dramatic changes can shift that person's worldview, because we know that not all of us are grown into that kind of privileged environment where everything is healthy and strong to begin with. Sometimes that even the foundation of that is not entirely accurate. And so when we talk about the issue of colonization, this is where intergenerational trauma happens, right? There's lots of really great, strong and supportive Indigenous families that are out there. But when you have a basis around things like trauma of residential schools or just racism in general, it shakes the foundation even before a person is born. And that can make things really quite complicated. Now, so I'm talking about the idealized version, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how in non-ideal situations it works. So basically, when some kind of trauma or loss happens, then the whole framework of who a person is needs to change. And so an example I like to give, just because it's kind of a silly one, is like the first love of your life. Inevitably, people talk about the very first person that they ever fell in love with, or that first crush that they had, how much it broke them when that wasn't either reciprocated, or people broke up, or they were dumped. And it's because it really shifts your whole idea of who you are. Well, maybe I'm not lovable. Maybe I'm not all these things that I thought I was. And so unhealthy adjustments when trauma or change happens can really shift a person's foundation. And so if COVID comes and hits, then sometimes people think different things, like the world is really scary. As I thought it was safe. It's not. I'm weak. I'm not strong enough to deal with this. And the world is meaningless. What's the point? I hear this all the time in my therapy, working with people who are depressed, because quite honestly, I think people who are depressed or highly anxious are often really smart. And the reason why they're really smart is because they see the big picture. Like, what's the point of all of this? Right. And if they can't come up with an answer that's either spiritual or I like to work or something that gives them value in life, then it can really be this depressing hole. But what I often say when people say to me, what's the point of all this? I'm like, yeah, I know. We're all just going to keep spinning until the sun blows up. And then what's going to happen, right? Is that there's this nihilistic view of the world that that can be complicated for some people. And it's because they're not living in the naive world of that everything is perfect and pretty and there's a white picket fence. So what is a healthy adjustment then? Well, instead of falling apart and recreating that foundation of who you are, healthy adjustments are about realizing that maybe those core assumptions are naive, but how do I reinforce them in a way that actually makes sense? So the world isn't scary. The world is still benevolent. It's not out to get me, but I do need to protect myself sometimes. I do need to do things. And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing some extreme behavior out in our world, is that people are trying to that are feeling very shaken by this either COVID or the financial crisis that's happening for some people because of it, or their jobs, or that they're feeling really shaken. And so that they're trying to reinforce their own beliefs about the world by sometimes getting more and more extreme. And so what a healthy adjustment would be is, how do we find a way for me to feel whole still, but also recognizing that I have to do things to help reinforce my structure. Okay, so what I wanted you to do today is we're going to talk a lot more, hopefully, about how do we help support this situation? How do we help people move forward on it? Is there any questions before I go on? I'm just going to open up the chat so that if there is any, you can answer them and I can see it. All right, nothing yet. Great. So I'm just going to keep going. Recognizing grief and loss. So yes, you are grieving. Even if you're having a positive experience about this, I want you to keep in mind that that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That's super awesome, in fact. But that the people around you are grieving. And so we are grieving because we're grieving a world that's changed and different, right? None of us have ever gone through a pandemic before. None of us have had to make the adjustments that we've had to. And even healthy change often comes with loss. So loss is not just about death. Loss happens in any change. Positive ones are difficult ones. So for instance, when somebody gets married, there's losses that are associated with that, like in terms of loss of independence, loss of the ability to just decide where your socks go, like all of those kinds of things can be a pile up for people. And every little loss or every little change has a corresponding shift in your body and how you can handle it. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. But exposure creates loss, or trauma exposure creates loss as well. So for those of you that are out there, I know many of you work for FCSSs, is that keep in mind that even hearing stories over and over about loss can have an impact on you and your physiology. In fact, will have an impact on you and your physiology. And so we have to find ways to inoculate ourselves from that. Framing trauma and grief reactions help people make sense of the emotional experience. You'd be really surprised how many people I've talked to, and I'll say, well, it sounds like you're grieving around the pandemic. And they are actually quite surprised because they just don't frame it that way. But once we understand that we are grieving, we're grieving our inability to just go for a walk with a friend or to see our parents. We know they're not dead, but our ability to cope has changed, or our ability to interact with people has changed pretty dramatically. Okay. Oh, keep hitting the wrong button. Okay. So what do we, if I'm right, and think that collectively as a group, we're under a lot of pressure, and that pressure is really a form of grief, then we do know some things about grief, right? How we want grief to work and how grief actually works are very different. And so here's my 1-minute counseling session. I think this is super important. Anyone who's going through anything difficult or complicated or even really positive, right? If you got a new job, that comes with a certain amount of dysregulation. And so know that you're dealing with this experience the best way you know how, right? You're helping your clients, you're helping your the people you work with, your customers, you're helping your family, you're doing everything you can based on what you know, and that's good enough. And so you're dealing with this experience the best way you know how. Are we all going to look back and think there's different things we could do? And are we going to be hopefully looking back about how we could do it better if it happened again? Of course. But we only are as good as the tools we have in our toolbox. And so know that you're doing the best you can. I want everybody to stop shitting on themselves. And just like we talked about earlier, just kind of when we were briefly chatting before this started, is that we also need to stop shitting on other people too, right? And so this idea of what one person should and shouldn't do is really not a healthy place to come from. And I have a hard time with that too, because there are definitely some things and some belief structures and some political views that are coming forward that I don't agree with. But I also have to recognize some of that is about the grief that people are experiencing, and some of that is about the trauma that they're trying to figure out how to manage. And so as much as I can disagree with, I don't know, rodeos or people breaking of rules, I can disagree with that, but I also can recognize that where it's coming from is a place of feeling overwhelmed. And so remember when I talked earlier about empowerment, what people are doing is feeling empowered to try to feel better. And so they're empowering themselves to take control, and sometimes in ways that aren't always very positive for all of us. If you know, if you don't like how you're dealing with you're coping with things, then change it, right? I know it sounds deceptively simple, but once you start making a commitment to yourself to change, once that comes from not a place of judgment, but of accepting, I don't feel really good, so I have to do my Kermit arms, then change starts to happen, right? Nobody loses weight on a diet because they're angry at themselves for being overweight. It's not how losing weight works. Once you have accepted who you are, once you start treating yourself the way you believe that the people you love should be treated, then that's when change starts. So if you do like how you're dealing with it, be proud of it. That's awesome. Good for you. Forgive yourself and for mistakes. We all have made choices probably even in our whole lives, but especially in the last year, that maybe weren't exactly what we wanted to do, right? Some of us have gotten angry at our kids. Some of us have got stressed out with our partners. That's okay. What we can only do is not worry about what happened in the past, but move forward. Celebrate victories. I think we have taken more takeout in the last little while, celebrating the silliest things, but celebrate in the ways that you can, because it doesn't even matter if it's just Kermit arms. Celebrations are important. So what do we know also about grief then, right? Is that grief only happens or only feels good when it's in a place of comforting and acceptance. And so stop shooting on yourself. That's the first thing that I want you to know about grief. And then here's just a concept around what grief looks like. It's about making sense of what's happened around us. So how can we make sense of this, this pandemic? How do we make sense of who we are as a province, right? When I talked earlier about how privilege is really showing, the haves and the have-nots are quite, there's quite a stark difference in terms of how people are experiencing this pandemic. Some people are experiencing it very isolated in their homes, and some people are experiencing it out working because every day they still have to go to work and get food on the table. And is that fair? Is that not fair? How does that make sense for us as a society? Right? Certainly in terms of some of the experiences that we're having as a society around Black Lives Matter, around things like the experience of wanting to support, but also being critical of our police. All of these things are like a cultural reckoning that I think is happening. And some of it can be really positive for change, and some of it can be very difficult to manage, but we're trying to figure out who we are. Right? Not just as a society, but also, of course, in our families, in our relationships at home, because lots of people are having some pretty awkward conversations about vaccines and not vaccines and that kind of thing. But how do we make sense of these relations? How do we find who we are now, right? So as we struggle with that sense making, how do we decide how change is going to happen? How do we change as individuals? How have we changed as a society? And then finding benefit, right? And like I said to you earlier, there's been lots of great benefits in my life in terms of COVID. I've really simplified a lot of stuff, and I'm really quite glad. And when I come and do workshops like this, I do them from my home. So then I get to hang out with you and then go, I don't have to drive anywhere, which is kind of nice. So in the framework of all of this, then talking about what helps is super important too. Now, did somebody have a comment or a question? Okay, got it. Sorry now. So what helps? Well, this is the kind of conversation I wanted to have first. Let's stop sharing for a second. Okay, let's talk about all of us. What helps when we're feeling like we're grieving, when we're feeling overwhelmed? What kind of things help for you? I've already shared with you my Kermit arms. Somebody else come up with an answer for me, and then I'll share some more.
Well, I like to do deep breathing. That helps.
Deep breathing?
Yeah.
What do you
And then I've been taking a lot of courses online, and I think it helps me keep my mind off COVID.
So that's Mary Ellen who's talking, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mary Ellen, I agree with you. I've also been taking a lot more workshops online, right? Because I'm here, I might as well do something with my time. And a lot of people have been offering stuff for free too, right? So
Yeah.
That's really great. And also knowing yourself well enough to know staying occupied, right, is good. Yeah, I think for some people we get to do too much, and some people do too little, and finding the balance between what works is good. So We got in the chat, I hear exercise, talking with a friend. Yeah, at the beginning of this, I was really good at video chatting with my close friends, but I don't think I've talked to them in a while. So thank you for that reminder. When we're feeling off, talking is important. Walking and listening to music, Linda says. Linda, what kind of music though? That really is what matters. Meditating, yeah, any form of getting outside. Yeah. You know, that's one of the gifts that I think collectively that I've noticed is that when I go for a walk now, there's so many more people outside. And I think we get sort of sick of our own space, right? The national parks are getting busy, right? My husband complains because he's a photographer, and so he likes to go, you know, hunting birds and all sorts of things. But now he gets out of and there's other people around all the time. So now he's trying to find new places to go hide and take pictures. Self-development scripture, yeah, definitely people getting connected to their sense of spirituality. You know how I was talking earlier about that sense for meaning, what's the point of all this? Lots of people find the meaning, it can be part of their spiritual practice. That ritual can be really important in helping people feel grounded. If you're not a spiritual person or not a religious person, that ritual still is important, right? That connection to whatever it is that you want to be connected to, even if it's just your family, like that feeling of connection is super important. So yes, thank you, Chris. That's a great cooking. I win on this battle. I'll tell you why I win, because I am not a baker at all. And we are having foods class in my house every day. I've had cookies twice a day for like a week. It's been great. Online schooling has its upside. Now, my kitchen is a mess all the time, but that's a different story. Oh, you live next to a provincial park. That's really great. Yeah. Okay. So these are all the things that help for sure. Great. And, you know, when we talk about self-care, it's easy to talk about some of these basic things, right, that are just important to be who we are and how we're grounded. What I do want to challenge you, though, is to recognize that self-care is actually kind of a deceptive term. Really, I think we should be more and more talking about community care, right? And so those of you who work in FCSS are probably all about this, right? Because that's why your organizations exist, is that you can't have self-care without community care as well, because otherwise what we're just doing is blaming individuals for not taking care of themselves. That's really a bad mental health model, right? Because then what we do is say, oh, you're depressed, it's your fault, you didn't drink enough water or take enough walks. And we know that's all just bogus, right? At least I hope we do. That when somebody is struggling individually, it's not just that individual's responsibility to take care of themselves, it's our community response to how do we help support them. That's really, really kind of important. And so great. I love that you all gave me good self-care strategies, but it's a little bit of a setup. I also want you to pay attention to your neighbors. I want you to pay attention to your family and your friends as well, because the people who are struggling the most are often the least likely to be able to reach out for help. And so we want to make sure that we're taking care of yourself. Meryl talks about setting boundaries at work, compassion fatigue, inspiring others to focus, staff positively, best serve youth. Yeah, and I honestly don't believe that you can have good empathy without good boundaries. I don't think you can. And it's because if you over empathize with people, if you don't have good boundaries around taking care of yourself too, then that empathy turns to, as Brene Brown says, she says, empathy, compassion turns to resentment pretty easily. And so I'm sure many of you who are working out in the field can hear that. When you're not doing well yourself, you're definitely probably not able to be as involved with people as you normally are. Anyway, okay, I'm gonna go back to my screen after I set you all up. Yes, take care of yourself, but also, of course, make sure that you're taking care of other people too. So when we talk about what helps, then I use this screen in this conversation in every lecture that I talk about, but also in all of my counseling sessions that I work with too, is that we have to make sure that we're dealing with the bottom up, right? Bottom up approaches are really important. So the idea that, and so this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I know he's another old white guy who likes to talk about things, but he has an excellent theory around this idea of how do we deal with getting to be our best possible selves? So he uses the word self-actualization. Some people talk about uh, use other words, but this idea of being the best, most authentic version of yourself. Well, it's really hard in this situation right now in the middle of COVID to get to that point of where we start talking about creativity and morality and real great self-acceptance, right? That acceptance of the facts, that's another one right there. Lack of prejudice. It's really hard for us to be our best possible selves when we're going with things that really shake the foundation of who we are, if that are dealing with that safety piece, right? When I started talking about trauma-informed practice, if we don't have safety, then we can't really feel love, belonging, esteem, self-actualization until we feel safe. And so what I want to do is make sure that we're all spending time paying attention to those basics for ourselves, but around for the people as well. So breathing, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, all of those things, going to the bathroom, our physiological needs are primary. We need to make sure that we're taking care of those things first. That's why often in therapy, one of the first things I do is talk to people about how much water they're drinking, right? And it's not because increasing water actually increases somebody's mental health. It does help, but and it certainly doesn't hurt, but it's about empowering somebody to start taking care of the basics first. We can't talk about self-esteem if we haven't already, if we haven't slept in a while. And so as a society right now, where we're struggling is not just the physiological aspects, right? The people who are taking care of our hospitals will tell you that there's an awful lot of physiological issues that are going on, of course. But even if we're ourselves healthy, then safety is becoming problematic. And so as a society, we're all struggling. And so how do we help make people feel safe, including ourselves, right? And so make sure you do that. Now, I don't want to go on a long lecture about emotional regulation, because I think I did that ad nauseum in the last time I had this conversation, but I will go over the basics really quickly for you. Is that when we talk about emotional regulation, this is really a brain issue, right? And so emotional regulation is at the core of who we are. And so when you look at that amygdala, that little pink piece in the middle of this slide, our amygdala is really what's responsible for that feeling of fear and anxiety and stress. And so that is the part of our brain, that organ, it's right on the top of our brainstem. That's really important in terms of feeling okay. And that's the part that people are struggling with right now, is when we're feeling unsafe, we often have trouble. So our amygdala, really what it does do is it works like a fire alarm. And so it can handle a certain amount of stress. And keep in mind, stress, positive or negative, doesn't matter, still builds up. And so we only have like a glass of how much stress we can handle. And as the stress gets poured into that glass, if we get too much of it, we'll be overwhelmed. And that's why I wanted to warn you about that trauma word, because little t traumas or little stresses will all add up. And sometimes they're harder to manage because there's not one thing. We can't point to one thing saying, that's what stressed me out. What we have is we often look at for the big dump, right? How much stress, and then is that the one that's going to overwhelm me? Anyway, so our amygdala is like a smoke alarm. It can handle a certain amount of smoke before it goes off, but once we hit that threshold, that panic alarm sets. And so our brains, when we're panicking, how they work is our amygdala goes off. It sends cortisol and adrenaline into our system. That cortisol and adrenaline is how we hold our stress physiologically, right? So when I say trauma is in the body, that's what I mean. It's that adrenaline and cortisol holds itself in your body. And it sometimes gets to the point where your muscles can't figure out how to relax. And that can have wear and tear on different organs. So our amygdala goes off, sends all those that adrenaline and cortisol into our system when we're feeling unsafe. And then our hippocampus goes, hey, what should we do about this? Do I have a map? And so when we talk about the hippocampus, what I mean really is this part of your brain that's your memory center. So when we feel stressed and overwhelmed, we go immediately to that place of, what did I do last time? And if the last time you did it, something worked, like, oh, I went for a run and I felt better, then chances are that's what you're going to do. If you get to a point where you do not know what to do, that's when things go awry. So if your hippocampus, your amygdala says, oh, I feel unsafe, your hippocampus goes, I don't know what to do, because it has never had that experience before, then that's where we end up in a cycle of panic or feeling overwhelmed, or what we call dysregulated. Our hippocampus is really helpful, but none of us have a map for a pandemic, not except for the last year. And so this whole idea of how do we handle this is something that's really unknown, right? Even our politicians, who we have to manage and have a lot of probably opinions about how they're handling things, you got to remember that their amygdalas and their hippocampuses don't know how to deal with this either, right? So when we talk about fight or flight responses, our amygdala goes off, our hippocampus is like, hey, what should we do about this? But then the last step in this process is this prefrontal cortex, and that's your big front part of your brain. That's the thinking center. The problem is when your fire alarm is going off, it's really hard to think. This part of our brain actually turns off. And so we can't think the way we would normally. And so many of us, that COVID fatigue that we hear about, or that people talk about in the news, is really that we've got so much adrenaline and cortisol running in our system because for whatever reason we're feeling unsafe. And it's not always rational, right? We're in our home, nobody's coming, nobody's going. Why are we feeling unsafe? Often because of the news or those kinds of things. But this prefrontal cortex of ours is not working at full capacity. So we're in what some people are calling a COVID fog, right? And not all of us, for sure, but many of us. So this slide is really about that homeostasis. So how do we get it to a point where our brains aren't firing off or aren't throwing up smoke alarms? What we need to do is a ritual and routine. And so that's where that spiritual comment really struck me that Chris made earlier, is that if we have a pattern, if we have a map for what to do, then we often feel better. And so church is one of those maps, right? If we go through this place where we feel a sense of connection and support, then we can do these rituals and they can help us really feel grounded in the world. And of course, also feel connected to our higher power if that's something that feels good to you, right? For other people who don't have that kind of spiritual connection, then ritual and routine is also still really helpful. And that's why the kids that are in school, that can be really helpful, right? Because they get up every day, they're dealing with this amount of stress, but there's a certain amount of just putting one foot in front of the other that they know and they don't have to think about because that prefrontal cortex isn't working so well. So we want to help them have a map or routine. And so I was really good at routine at the beginning of the pandemic. I really have to try to get back into that now so that you kind of feel a sense of normalcy. And keep in mind that a lot of people's experiences of normalcy has changed pretty dramatically. People have lost jobs. People have been working off and on or in school off and on. And that constantly changing really pays havoc on our amygdalas and our nervous systems. Okay, so what are we having? Basically, all of this is to talk about emotional regulation. And so our nervous systems have this parasympathetic, it's all part of your autonomic nervous system, a sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. There's no test on this. One is your fight or flight response and the other is the rest and digest. Our bodies are always constantly in a state of trying to find this balance between excitement and rest. Right. And when we're in the middle of this is what emotional regulation feels like, is a balance. Sometimes I'm excited, but I also have time to calm down. Sometimes I feel anxious, but I also know how to take care of myself. And so that we're always looking for that. And if we're too anxious, our body will have systems to try to help calm it down. If we're not, if we're depressed and in that rest and digest phase too much, our body also has normal systems that'll help pull it up. And all of this happens without our knowledge or consent or understanding. Our bodies are just really good at this. And what trauma does is sometimes throws this balance out of whack. So we get stuck in this fight or flight response, or we get stuck in this rest or digest response. Or even worse is when we kind of get flip-flop between the two, right? So one is really an anxious response, one is a depressed response. And then sometimes we kind of get flipping through. It's not this nice, firm balance. It's like, I'm either really anxious or I'm really depressed. And so we want to be careful about these things. How do we destabilize a dysregulated system? Well, this is the basics of it. I'm just going to look to see how much more time we have. Great. So how do we destabilize a dysregulated system? Well, basically what the 911 or the emergency first aid is this is what I'm talking about. The only way for us to really manage feeling when we're dysregulated is to actually use somebody else to help us re-regulate. And that's why connection is super important. If you see somebody who's having a panic attack, the best thing you can do is not even necessarily talk to them. It's just to sit with them. And because then they'll feel safer. And then you can reassure. And then if you stay calm, their nervous system will come in to yours, rather than if you get anxious and worried. Anybody who has a teenager will know this, right? If you get anxious and worried and upset about them being nervous and upset, is that it's just both of you are going to be nervous and upset. We also have to deal with the emotional release. Once the system has become super dysregulated, it is not the time to talk about what's happening. It's like talking in the middle of a grocery store to a kid that's having a temper tantrum. You can't ask them about how they're feeling. They're showing you how they're feeling. So what you need to do is just ride that wave, let the emotion run, and let that adrenaline and cortisol get out of their system. And then you can actually do the processing later. But really, when the middle of somebody feeling really dystable or dysregulated, there's nothing you can do except for ride the wave. And that's totally okay. Keep people safe, ride the wave, right? And so safety is about dealing with ongoing threats. And so if you're feeling really unsafe and you don't know why, sitting there trying to figure out why you're unsafe isn't really helpful. What you need to do is feel more safe. And so one way to do that is actually move, right? Leave the room. Get off of a conversation that's making you feel uncomfortable. We may not know what's making us feel unsafe, but your amygdala does. And so because your amygdala is constantly scanning the room for things that are going to make it feel unsafe or things that could possibly be dangers, then it's paying attention to all the things like smell, what you see, what you hear, those kind of things. And so keep in mind, these are real or perceived. Your amygdala doesn't care if it's something that happened in the past or if it's something it's worried about in the future. It is really kind of dumb. All it knows is fear. And so if you're thinking about something that happened, your amygdala will have a physiological response like it's happening now. And that's what's really important to know is your amygdala is not very smart. So it doesn't understand past or present. And so your physiology will respond like there's a lion in the room, even though there's not a literal lion in the room. It could be just you thinking about feeling it. Okay. And then of course the biological is stress. How do we deal with the stress hormones? And so we can talk about that in a minute. I just want to check in. Is everybody still doing okay? Any questions? You're doing all right. Good. I have to run out and put my little one to bed. That's awesome. Go do that. Okay. All right. I'll just keep going then. All right. It just gave me a time to breathe for a second. Okay. So how do we go from here? Well, if your amygdala is something that is responding to you and to the people around you from the five senses, then one of the ways to deal with it is to remind your body that you're okay now. And so we can do that through our senses, right? And so what can we do to support ourselves? You guys all brought up some of these things. Now, is somebody talking? Okay, so you already brought up a lot of these things already, right? Breathing, good food, ritual, exercise, sleep, self-soothing, mindfulness, self-compassion. That these are all things that can help ourselves when we're feeling not okay. And so one of the tips I use, and you can use with the people you work with, is the idea of those mental health first aid kits, right? This idea of having like a box of things that make you feel good, that smell good, that sound good, that feel good. Now, all of you are going to have different avenues to feeling of safety, but one of the best ways to know about safety is to think about what kind of things feel. helpful, or what kind of things did you do as a kid that helped you feel better? And we'll get to that conversation in a little bit. So self-regulation can only occur outside of fight, flight, or freeze response. When your system is dysregulated, when you're in that fight or flight response or in that rest and digest, if you're totally out of whack, if you're completely dysregulated, then you are not capable in that moment of taking care of yourself and calming yourself down. And that's what's really interesting to know, is that we are at nature relational people. And that amygdala response, that fear response, is actually, that's something that is ingrained in us when we're born. And so we already have that fear response that comes. And that's how I know that babies cry, because they don't feel regulated. They don't feel safe. So they cry, and then they get their caregiver to come and help support them and take care of their needs, right? Well, our nervous systems, like our prefrontal cortexes, our more complicated thinking processes, have definitely developed over as we've aged, but our fight and flight system changes very little. And so what our fight and flight system needs is the same thing it needed when we were little, is it needs to feel reassured, it needs to feel safe, and it needs to feel okay. And you cannot often do that for yourselves, not unless it's been a whole panic attack and your body just shuts down because it's exhausted, right? So what can we do for it? Self-regulation can only occur outside of fight, flight, or freeze response. You cannot rationalize with an irrational person, right? You can't ask the kid that's throwing a temper tantrum to tell you how they feel. And that is true of yourself, and that is true of your partner, and that is true of the people that we work with, and our teenagers and our kids. We can't rationalize them when they're upset. We have to actually wait until their prefrontal cortex, that part of their brain, is turned back on. Right now, they're just running. And so what can we do, is the only thing we can do is help regulate somebody else. If you're feeling really upset, then know that the only thing you can do is often be around, right? I actually like to go to coffee houses when pre-COVID, just to sit and not to actually talk about what's going on for me, but just to sit with people who are actually living their lives and feeling calm can actually really help. So trauma at its core is about disconnection, healing. Therefore, it can only really happen through connection. That's one of the things that's important to know, is that when we're feeling really upset and dysregulated, it's often because there's a problem in our relationships, right? Our relationships with ourselves, our relationship with our health, our relationships with the people around us. And so the best way to build trust and empowerment, those 5 components of trauma-informed practice that we talked about earlier, the best way to do that is through relationship. And so this is the beauty of what we're talking about, is the only thing you need to do if you're worried about a family member, if you're worried about a kid, if you're worried about your mother, if you're worried about the relationships in your life, the only really magic trick to any kind of help is that you just need to be slightly calmer than the person that you're with. That's all you need to do. And so if somebody's really upset around you, or if they're really struggling, then as long as you are a little bit calmer than they are, then their nervous system will come match yours. The truth is also the opposite. If you respond to somebody with a lot of anxiety and aggression, they will likely respond back, because of this concept we call neuroception. Our nervous systems actually read each other pretty well. And so how we react is going to be important. The emotional responses, how do we deal with that? I said to you, ride the wave. Fighting only makes it last longer. Judgment only makes you feel less safe. And so often what we do is judge ourselves when we're feeling upset. And so what that often does is just makes it feel like you're more at risk, right? So when your amygdala is responding in a way that feels unsafe, and your prefrontal cortex is saying, why are you being so stupid? I can't believe you're reacting to this. Why are you being so emotional? It only makes that deeper part of your brain feel less safe. And then more adrenaline, more cortisol goes into your system. And then that's when we start struggling with panic attacks, because you end up in this loop of becoming judgmental against yourself, and then creating this place where your body feels unsafe and reacts. So self-compassion is really the key here. And so that's where, when I was talking earlier about your 1-minute counseling session, is stop shitting on yourself. You're doing all the best you can. And if we can start there, then lots of things are possible in terms of taking care of ourselves, in terms of coping, and of course, taking care of each other. is that if we can come with it with compassion and connection, they're the key to really the answer of how do we deal with this. Now, self-compassion is super easy to say, really difficult to do. Only can we accept that we are enough just as the way we are, warts and all. Will long-term stable change be possible? If we come at changing ourselves with judgment, so often in my practice, I'll have people come to me, sit down and say, tell me what to do, how to fix myself. And my response to them is always, well, I don't think you're broken, right? Bad things happen, but I don't think you're broken. And because we have to come to the point of finding that self-compassion, right? And demonstrating that to the people around us. And that's when long-term change is possible. Self-compassion is the alignment of the emotional, intellectual selves. And so I often talk about the brain and the heart, right? There's this beautiful web comic out there. It's called Heart and Brain. It's through a website called The Awkward Yeti, for any of you who are interested in taking a look at it. When I had my waiting room open, I had these comic books, little books all around my waiting room. And the Heart and Brain is a really interesting way to look at trauma and anxiety. And so having that disconnection between what our heart thinks and what our brain thinks is definitely the root of a lot of our problems and how we react to stress, right? And that's what I said earlier. The mind and the body are the same thing, right? Your mental health and your physical health are the same thing. So grounding, of course, we already talked about that. And this is something I alluded to earlier, is what did you do to soothe yourself as a child, right? And so I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to ask that question to you. So if I'm telling you that that fear response is really ingrained in the middle of your brain, then, and each of us is unique about it, then each of us is a different answer to that question, right? So for me, what I recognize is that I am really a tactile kind of person, right? So I like to wear tight clothings and big sweaters. So for me, what helped me as a child is like I can feel my dad's arms, like when I was little and I was stressed out, he would give me a back rub and I can feel them when I think about that, right? Which is lovely because he died 5 years ago. So it makes me feel really close to him when I feel that, right? That's why this makes me happy too, because then I can feel him on my shoulders. Anyone else? What about you? What kind of things as a child help soothe you?
Being outside in nature.
Yeah. So being connected, and that one's good because it's all of your senses, right? Like, the sights, the smells, the feels. I used to write in my closet. I love that. It's like being in a little cocoon. Music was the go-to. That's lovely. The smell of Vicks, I love that. That smell of Vicks Vapor Rub, right? Like there's nothing that feels like comfort to me quite like that. Being with friends. And so somebody who Reagan or is very social, dancing, yeah, kind of things. My son is also a tactile person, right? And it took me a long time to notice that, but he has a blankie and he still has it. But he has this, it's just this soft one, and he would always cuddle up with it and stick his finger in this little hole that is in it when he goes to sleep. And you'll notice I have like a whole load of scarves. I used to wear scarves a lot, I still do. And he would just cuddle in and just play with my scarf or my hair. And so what I recognize is that as a little kid, he's a tactile kind of self-soother. And so as he gets older, we bought him a weighted blanket, right? That has a similar feel to what it was, because his nervous system is clearly tactile. So what we do is, how do you grow up some of those childhood things so that they can be part of our adult coping too, right? So keep those in mind. If you don't know what makes you feel better, then do it. Me, it's tea. I love the smell of tea, right? Do I look like it's the size of my head? I think that's so funny. It doesn't look like it when, with that, but yeah, that whole idea of what kind of things can help calm us down. And talking about it, we often used to think that we all had to talk about everything that was going on in our lives. That's not true. Talking can definitely help. It is the basis of my profession. So I don't want you to talk out of, I don't want to talk myself out of a job, but the reality is feeling safe now is the most important thing, right? And that how do we make ourselves feel safe now?
I have to share something. I saw a couple people say that they live by the ocean, and I used to like being in the sandbox. And as an adult, like I would give anything to be like in the sun in Mexico with my toes in the sand. That would make me feel so good. And I actually saw someone on Facebook made a sandbox and put it underneath their desk, so that they're sitting working and their toes are in the sand.
That
Is
is
that not, isn't that cool? And then just imagine like a heat lamp too. Like that's what I'm doing. I'm doing it.
yeah, that I want to do that right now too with your that's really great. I used to read fairy tales. I was always the hero that outsmarted the villain. I love it, right? Like that's another great thing. And we're not human beings are not complicated animals in many ways. The things that worked when we were little still work now, whether we like to admit it or not. And so keep that in mind. Yeah, when you're doing it, when you're doing whatever it is that you're doing out there, and keep that in mind for the people that we work with and that we love, right? Is that you already know some things about them. And so like, can you imagine if somebody just showed up at your house with a sandbox? Said, I noticed this part about you, and we're all having a tough time. I thought I'd share it. Yeah. Had a beautiful story about one of my clients who she was like on a Zoom chat, like with this, like they met every week because to help them with their COVID fatigue kind of stuff. And so one of them they wanted to get all organized to go meet somewhere, and she just did not feel safe. And so she was brave enough to say to them, like, I just can't. Like, I just can't. I don't, it doesn't feel good. I know that you guys all need to and go, but my mental health is not in a state right now that I can deal with this. And you know what they did? They put together like a total care package for her. They said, whatever you need, that's okay. They went and did their meeting because that's what they needed to do. But as part of it, they said, we wanted to know we were thinking of you while we were there. And so they put together a care package for her and dropped it off at her house. Like, oh, that's wonderful, right? And so it doesn't take much. Oh, you guys have a virtual coffee every day. That's brilliant. Okay, I'm going to keep barreling through. Thanks. I love these chats. They make me happy. Okay, so keep in mind the things that others did for you, things that you did for yourself as a child are often the keys to what we need, even as grown-ups. It's just how do we find a way to make it work? Now, good. I'm just going to skip the slide. We've talked about it. Okay. And then I end up talking about it anyway, right? So there's different things in terms of how do we manage biological responses to stress, right? And so in the immediate, if you're having some kind of panic or anxiety response, one of the things that's going to help is movement. And so that's what we were doing with our Kermit arms earlier. But if you have all that adrenaline and cortisol that's dumped into your system in that panic kind of response, then exercise will help move that through your system so your kidneys and liver can help function. Breathing, of course, also helps oxygenate your blood, which can help move those stress hormones through your systems as well. And of course, helps give your muscles some comfort or oxygen in order to help build and rebuild. Comfort counteract negative stress responses with positive ones. So if adrenaline and cortisol is the enemy, then how do we get some oxytocin in our systems? How do we get some serotonin in our systems? And so being silly, doing other things that make us feel loved and supported, reaching out to coworkers, talking to people, all can be really helpful in that immediate response. In the short term, of course, food, water, sleep, taking care of those biological imperatives are important. And so if you can't control what's going on in the world, if you can control what you eat, what you drink, and how you sleep, although sleep can be kind of complicated. But if you can go back to the basics, then that'll really help manage that long-term stress response. Because yes, adrenaline and cortisol dumps are problematic to our systems, especially if they're happening all the time. They'll have a lot of wear and tear on our organs, like our stomachs. Often we'll get a lot of people with IBS or chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia. All of these are stress-related illnesses that are biological in nature, but people used to talk about them being all in people's heads, right? Oh, she's just making it up, it's all in her head. But they're real physiological responses to large amounts of adrenaline and cortisol. And so those big dumps are problematic, but so are small doses of cortisol and adrenaline over long periods of time. So even if you're not in a full out panic response, if you're constantly managing a lot of adrenaline and cortisol in your system, you will get wear and tear on your heart, on your lungs, on your stomachs, on all of your organ systems. And of course, that wear and tear is going to look a little different for each of us, depending on our DNA. And the long term, what we need to do is create that regular schedule, the rituals, and then take care of general self-care as well as community care, right? And I really should be adding that to that slide, is that how are we not just taking care of ourselves, but what kind of things are we doing to help support each other? Boundaries are also important. And I'm so glad that that was brought up already. You guys are already the experts in all of this, so I'm probably just preaching to the choir. Without boundaries, empathy becomes a threat to our system. It creates more adrenaline, more cortisol. So we need to have times to allow ourselves to manage and to sit, right? Learning to say no without guilt or shame. Own your own feelings, but do not take responsibility for feelings that aren't yours. This is really hard. I'm learning with teenagers is that as a parent, that I'm constantly wanting to help make things better for them. And unfortunately, in a situation like this, I have no control over whether they're quarantined or not quarantined, or if school's happening or not happening. And so I feel responsible to fix that. But it's also okay for my kids to struggle, right? That's going to teach them how to manage, how to deal with that stress response all on their own. And that's important. All I have to do is sit with them, right? That's what I told you earlier, is all we have to do is slightly be less stressed out than they are, and it should help. Respecting others' self-determination. This is a hard one for me around vaccines, right? My brother was really kind of lollygagging about getting some vaccines for his kids, and I really just kept wanting to make the appointments for him. But people have a right to self-determine and decide if they want to struggle or if they don't want to struggle, if they want to get vaccinated, if they don't want to get vaccinated. And so we have to respect other people's ability and not take responsibility for other people's actions. And prioritizing your own needs, but most importantly, listening to your body. I really feel like I'm just running out of time. So developing boundaries, basically being authentic, recognizing non-negotiables, making space in your life for things, and that feeling of connection. This is just a wrap up of all the different stuff that we've talked about today, is being honest with ourselves, being honest with our others, being yourself is important. And then of course, listening to your body. What is it telling you? What does it need? Does it need to do something goofy? Does it need to go to bed? Does it need to eat? All of these are super important. Ritualize non-negotiables. So develop routines that are important and that make sure that you're spending time doing what you need. So you don't need to feel guilty for going a walk for every morning. If it's something that you do every day, it becomes something that you just do every day, that you don't need to make time for it. Because self-care so often is stuff that goes off the wayside or first, because, oh, I don't have time for that. But what you need to do is figure out what kinds of things does you and your body and your mental health need, and then put them in the list of non-negotiables. This is what I need to do every day. Develop routines, take time for the basics, build in downtimes. Your nervous system needs it. So don't feel guilty about watching Netflix at the end of the day. Don't feel guilty about, I don't know, doing what you need to do on your phone if that's part of it. Make sure that we're not avoiding, but also building in downtime is also important, as long as it's feeding your soul and not sucking energy from it. Checking in with yourself. Saying no, always make space for yes, of course. Make space in your life for space, right? Whether that be outside, or not. Protect your limited resources, because what I've noticed in all of this is that my line of work is really about helping support people, but there's such a large need out there that I also have to make sure that I have time to support somebody like my mom, who lives alone and is experiencing this pandemic in a very personal and very upsetting way for her. And so I can't just give all my resources to everyone else around me. I also have to make sure that I'm spending time and making space for the people that are important to me. Connection, have a person, personally and professionally. I always think this is really important. I love a check-in, right? So I do the work that I do. Some of it can be very intense and emotionally draining, but because we can't rationalize with an irrational person, when we're in that fight or flight response, we're not using this part of our brain. What we also have to recognize is that sometimes we won't know when we're not working properly. And so having a friend, having a colleague, having a family member who can tell you when you're off is part of that social care, right? That you have to have like a trusted advisor. And because they're the ones that are going to help support you and notice, probably long before you'll ever notice you're in trouble. And that's interesting. I actually had a conversation just a couple days ago with one of my clients who I had asked her about she was talking about dark thoughts. And so I asked her about her suicidal thoughts, like use that word. And she came back to me. Well, the other day when I was talking to her, she had come back to me, and this was 6 months after our conversation about those dark thoughts. And she said to me, you know what, Krista, I didn't realize how bad they were. I didn't realize that that wasn't normal. And so she was using me as a reflection, right? As I could reflect back to her. And so that's why connection is really important, is the more we isolate, the more we can't trust what we think. And so having somebody that you do trust that will tell you when they notice you're struggling or will check in on you is really important. And I feel that professionally as well as personally. And then I have a plan for reaching out, and then exactly what you guys said earlier, or some of you said, spending time in nature can be awesome. I bring this slide back up only because I just want to remind you is to making time to make sense, finding benefit, and recognizing how you've changed over the course of time can be really helpful in terms of this grieving process that I think we're all going through. And then, of course, working on strengths and building healthy family or belief systems. The world is meaningful, but sometimes it's hard to find the meaning, right? That's important. Recognizing when your belief systems are becoming unhealthy, that's also important, and challenging them, or have other people help you challenge, so that you can be intentional about creating healthy adjustments to your internal working model. So I am doing my best. I can keep myself safe. Sometimes it's hard to understand the meaning. Sometimes I need to protect myself. Finding ways to use that cognitive ability for us to remind ourselves that we are safe, we're secure. Okay? And then limiting the things that make us feel unsafe, right? So for me, for instance, I've stopped reading any news about COVID generally, because what I find is that the more I read about the disease, the more unsafe I feel. So what I have done is I check the vaccine numbers every day. And so every day I'm like, there's been 20,000 more people vaccinated today. There's been 30,000 more. I got very excited. There was almost 60,000 people last Friday, right? And so instead of paying attention to the darkness that I have no control over, I start paying attention to things that build hope. Okay, so back to the beginning. I made you do an exercise the first time about my Kermit arms. This is my last one. I showed some of this one before. I was inspired, so. In my pajamas, by the way. I don't think you can hear the music, but I'm sure you can appreciate the dancing. I like showing that video just because it makes me laugh. Yeah. Oh, you can hear it. That's good. I'm glad I stopped it because I was worried you couldn't hear it, and because my belly started to show, so it felt like it was time to be enough. The best thing that you can do for yourself is to keep connected to your body. And that will be the one thing that'll help you more than anything else. And so, yeah, dance when you're by yourself in the shower, sing, whatever you need to do to help that connection. Because I think so often we get stuck in our head, we forget that our body exists, right? I don't know how many of us have probably sat on Zoom calls for 8 hours and been like, why do I feel like crap? Well, I know why you feel like crap. Our bodies are not meant to do that. They're meant to dance. They're meant to be silly, and they're meant to do those kinds of things. So please, I hope you can do that. Anyway, so any questions or comments? Any reactions? We have a couple minutes. Actually, we don't, but you can stay for a couple minutes if you would have anything you want to say. I don't know. I feel like here's an instruction about vulnerability. When somebody's vulnerable and they dance in front of you, you have to at least put your voice in the room and say something, because otherwise I get into an anxiety tornado.
I know personally, after a year of COVID, I was finally getting used to it. So I was really anxious. And then the night that they said on the news that the variant was in Alberta, I just lost it. My heart started pounding. I started crying. And that was just one too many bricks on the pile. And I decided that that was the night that I can't watch the news anymore. Because before that, I was getting angry watching the news, because why can't all these people just follow the rules and we would have been over it?
Yep.
And so, yeah, so I agree. I had to stop watching the news because it was just making it too hard.
Yeah, and good for you, Mary Ellen, for recognizing that in yourself. And I know, just like me, it would be nice to recognize it before it gets to that part, but sometimes we miss it, right? Is that if there are things you can't control, it doesn't make a lot of sense to focus on them, right? It's okay to and want to be informed, for sure. And I think being informed is super important, but you need to dose it, right? Like we don't need to watch everything. And that idea of dosage is really kind of important to me. Is I can handle a certain amount of stuff, but I can't handle all of the stuff. So how do I create boundaries around that? And so, Mary Ellen, I'm glad to hear that you created that boundary. The other thing that I heard from what you just said is that hope sucks. It's really, really brutal when you lose it, right? And because it's such a powerful thing in our lives, is when we all saw those needles going into arms in the end of December, and we're like, holy crap, we're gonna get there. And then to all of a sudden have things taken away is brutal, right? And that's often when things get dangerous, right? And that's why I worry about suicide rates and mental health at this point in time, because I think we're so close that hope is real, but the danger of losing that hope is also can be devastating for some. And so, Mary Ellen, good for you. Right? We don't need to do that.
Christmas time was the first time in 64 years that I haven't been with my family, that I was by myself. And now I Skyped with them for like 2.5 hours. And I had lots of invitations from other people to go to their place. But I said to my sons, I said, the worst thing is I'm used to moving mountains. And all of a sudden, I find I can't move this mountain. I can't make COVID disappear. I can't make it safe for me to go to see you guys. And coming to that and admitting that, it felt good to kind of say, okay, I don't have control over this. So stop being frustrated about it and accept it.
Well, and that gets back to those stuff around trauma-informed practice, right? Is the idea of empowerment is so important. And so if we keep focusing on the things we can't control, then we feel helpless, right? And so focusing on the things that you can, great, you can move mountains. That's pretty amazing, but you can't do it right now.
Exactly.
Right? So what kind of mountains can you move? Well, I don't know. And hopefully you found some. I can move piles of laundry. I'm really good at that. Yeah. Unfortunately, Catherine, sorry, like total aside from what you're saying, but that one of the comments that keeps coming up from it is that sense of control is part of the reason why I'm seeing so many eating disorders right now, is that people can't control things, so that they start controlling what they put in their mouth. And that can be really healthy, but sometimes it can go to the unhealthy realm too, right? And so certainly with some of the teenage girls I'm working with, that's what I'm seeing, is that they started losing weight because they were spending a lot of time paying attention to what they ate, and then it became an addiction, right? But the more out of control they felt, the more they controlled what they were eating, and that's problematic. And so watch, good coping strategies can also turn negative if overused. Anyway, somebody was going to say something, and Lola,
Yeah.
I also know that you need to wrap up too before people start leaving.
Yeah, and that's. I was just gonna jump in, and please don't feel like you need to log off. But I just want to get a chance to ask an outcome question, just before people start logging off. So, for those of you FCSS folks out there, please don't judge me. It's not, you're not gonna find this on our provincial outcome list, but it's what I've got. I'm doing the best I can. The best I can. So I find this to be the most effective way to get an outcome question out. So I'm going to give you guys a choice here. You can either respond, if it's a positive response, then just say something in the chat, give a thumbs up, or give a Kermit arms.
Oh, Kermit arms. Yes,
Yes,
Kermit arms.
yes, I really hope to see lots of Kermit arms. So if you are feeling better able to cope with the stress that you're feeling due to COVID, and better able to cope with the stress that others are feeling, then let's see Kermit arms or thumbs up or something. I'm not seeing Kermit arms. Let's go. Hooray. Awesome. Kermit all day long. Awesome.
If you ever want to know why I love Kermit so much, you just have to look up like Kermit quotes. He has some great quotes. Totally awesome.
I just want to know, whenever you sent this video out to your friends, did you just like do it, or did you say, this is why I'm doing it, or did you just send it out there?
Well, to be honest with you, I did tell them a little bit. I said, I was doing this about like, what do you want to just do? And I was telling my client, and I said, I just want to throw Kermit arms up. And so then when my client left, I told them that, right? This is what I was doing with the client. This is why I did it. And I'm sending these to you, where I kind of wish I just threw Kermit arms up.
I feel
who
like
needs context?
I feel like I might just do that tomorrow, you know? I already see there's kids outside in the skateboard park, and I think they're seeing me doing this in the window, and they're like, what the heck is going on? I think it could be amusing. I might just do it.
It's just like, when, I don't know if you've all had this experience, but I'm sure many of us have, who live in cities anyway, is that when you watch some like teenager that's like dancing on the corner with their, like, don't you just love that? Like, I think it's my favorite thing ever. So why not do that for other people? Like, you see the guy grooving like nobody's driving through an intersection. We need more of that stuff. Anyway, that's just me sitting on my soapbox. Great. I appreciate all the comments that are coming in the chat room. Thank you very much. I enjoyed my time, and I'm glad you appreciate my Kermit arms.
And thank you for joining us again, Krista. I think that I feel even better this time than I did last time. So thank you for that, and I hope that everybody else does too.
Well, good. I'm hoping that I'm hoping it wasn't too repetitive. I tried to mix it up, but some of it's just like I was sitting there with the slides, and I'm like, but some of this is just too good. I can't take it out. So we're gonna do some of it again, and maybe I'll say something more interesting.
No, it was great. And actually, I am getting some messages also about wanting the slides.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'll send them to you.
And those, and plus we are recording, so I'll be sending out the video recording to everyone who's registered too. And like I said, we have our YouTube channel now, so
Okay.
Yeah.
And my Kermit arms are going on YouTube. Lovely.
They're going on YouTube. They're going on YouTube.
You need to promise that you'll be kind with me and not share my Kermit arms or my dancing on social media. You have to do it your own.
Okay, that's fair.
Not my slides, you'll have the video, but you need to do your own.
Okay.
I'm just teasing. I don't really care. Put it out there in the world. All right.
Okay.
Well, Lola, I think that's it. I know
Yeah, people are jumping off now. So
people are jumping off. Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, Rolanda. Thanks, Catherine, for showing your lovely faces. It's always nice to see somebody. Thanks, Jason. Mary Ellen, for your comments. That's great. And every